Tips from Trestle is brought to you by Wiseox AI, the Dining with Dementia Workshop, and the 100% Leader. Welcome to Tips from Trestle, the Senior Living Food and Hospitality Podcast. This podcast explores the senior living industry with a unique focus on food, hospitality, and the community experience. I'm your host, Aaron Fish. My goal for this podcast, bringing the resident and customer experience to the front of mind in our industry. We should bring the passionate spirit of food and hospitality to everything that we do and everyone we serve each and every day. So what are we waiting for? Let's get to it. This week on Tips from Trestle, we're taking a higher level look at a subject that no senior living leader wants to face, but one that we've talked about that we need to be ready for on this podcast: disaster preparedness and recovery. My guest is Claudine Ripert of Critical Control. Claudine helps organizations look beyond the immediate emergency and prepare for the full life cycle of a disaster, predicting risk, protecting people and property, making high-stakes decisions quickly, and navigating the long tail of financial recovery. In senior living, this work is especially personal. We're not just protecting the building. We are protecting residents, their homes, their belongings, and the teams trusted to care for them. Claudine shares why quarterly stakeholder conversations, clear decision authority, policy knowledge, vendor readiness, and strong documentation can make all the difference when your community is ready. So let's get into our conversation with Claudine Ripert. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I really appreciate it.
I've had other individuals on to talk about emergency preparedness and what it takes to get your communities ready. But when we talked, what I appreciated was the larger holistic picture that you take to it and focusing on everything that happens after, right? And that's something that we've not really talked about on the podcast. And so for listeners who may not be familiar with the work that you do at Critical Control, just briefly walk us through this focus on disaster preparedness and recovery for senior living communities.
Yes, absolutely. So, disaster recovery and preparedness. So, we're talking really here, just to get super clear, about properties, like the actual property damage. But when we're talking about property damage, we have to talk about predictive views and understand how do we actually get data around information on our property so that we can protect not only the property, but obviously the residents inside. So definitely we'll talk about the predictive view, the actual restoration piece of it. So then we're talking about the structure and maybe contents inside. And then we're talking about the actual recovery. And when I say recovery, just to split hairs, we're really talking about typically the insurance aspect or the post cost financial that actually hits the senior living that was affected.
Yeah, you alluded to it a little bit there. You work through this kind of three-pillar framework that you've used. You predict, prepare, and recover. And so I'd love for you to take those three, break those down a little bit more for us and what those mean in practice for a senior living community or a senior living operator.
So we really focus in on senior living, and that also includes nonprofit housing as well, that typically has seniors. And the reason why is that it's a susceptible community. There is a need for insight and really going upstream pre-disaster. And when I'm talking about pre-disaster, I'm talking about predictive views. So things like satellite insights, data that comes in not off of the news or sometimes off of free websites, but typically it's both private and public sites that are going to speak and get algorithms for that specific property, or sometimes senior livings have multiple properties. And we're actually watching for what is going to be happening? What is the event, the peril, a flooding, a fire? We're getting just about a little bit of everything these days. What is going to be the significance in that peril, the impact? So there's data that starts to come through and streams in terms of when things are going to hit that specific geolocation and at what level of certitude and what is the expected damage, or it can be the expected precipitation or the flooding. If it's near a flood zone, even if it's not near a flood zone, what are we expecting to come in? And why is that important for senior living? Is because ultimately the question is the damage needs to be assessed early on so that options are taken into consideration in a timely manner so that are we going to relocate? Are we not going to have to relocate? There is so much that goes into when you are having to relocate residents from senior living, and there's so much preparation that has to occur upstream as well. So you're taking that information and that data, it becomes very key. You've got mobility issues and such that you really need to take into account. Also, where will they be relocating to? Do you have your network set up? Do you know that you're going to be going to 7 miles out because you've got this data on the predictive view that says 7 miles to the east, everything's going to be fine. Okay, so that's my network. That's where I'm going to probably relocate them. Maybe it'll be another senior living. There's networks that need to be set up there. So that predictive view, when we're looking at that, we're really talking about the satellite, the algorithms, getting the imagery and understanding what is going to be happening and when and to what extent.
When you think about this prediction and prevention gap, when you are walking a community, starting that assessment of how you're going to support them through this entire life cycle, what are some of the most common blind spots you find when you are in that community for the first time?
Yeah, I think the common blind spot that we have is so we're going to get this predictive view. We're going to have this understanding that there will be options and we'll have a timeline. And can we speak to somebody who can make a decision within an hour or 2 hours? Because resources dry up, materials will be gone. There's pipeline. You will not be the only senior living that is going to have an impact. And outside of you and senior living, there's going to be manufacturing. There'll be hospitality. There'll be all these other things and all these other properties. So who can make that decision and to what extent can they make the decision? I think that what we see that really creates bottlenecks and that ripple have a ripple effect through the entire process is when someone's been given alleged authority. And when I say alleged authority, they'll be given the authority to make a $2,500 decision. When there's a peril, there are no $2,500 decisions. We're talking $200,000 decisions. We're talking a $500,000 decisions.
Yeah.
And so there's this I'm the point of contact and speak through me. But if that person then has to go to a property manager, a risk manager, and then ultimately the owner and the asset manager, we really need to have that conversation and have what I call like a moatless ability to have access to the real decision maker. Because we're talking very tight timelines here. And if we have a predictive view, but then we kill it with the indecision, essentially we're back to square one and we're reacting just like everybody else.
I can definitely relate to that bottleneck of what you're talking about as far as they're not really a decision maker, but they're the point of contact and they're having to funnel all this information through. That happens even in operations. And so I can thinking about the immediacy of an event. And speaking of that, one of the things that I think I want to get a little bit more insight from you about is when we're actually like living in that disaster moment, like when it's actively happening, right? Regardless of what type of a disaster, what are some of those first critical decisions that a leader needs to make in, say, the first 24 hours?
Yeah, absolutely. So the decisions that they need to make is, are we going to be able to stay in place, or are we going to be able to are we going to have to relocate? And if we can stay in place, then there's a number of other questions that open up. Yes, we can stay in place provided that we create berms and sandbags, or we protect this east wing that is most susceptible to being hit. What are the precautions that need to be taken ahead of time? And sometimes securing those resources is really all that's needed. We can secure, instead of having $1 million loss, and I feel like I'm not necessarily exaggerating on on costs when it comes to perils. It adds up very quickly. And I kind of want to desensitize. I'm calling these numbers out because I think that people can really feel like they're very light decisions, and they're not. It's really, you have to have the ability to make these decisions quickly. And
Yeah.
so if you don't have to relocate and you can stay in place, provided you do these 3 things, because you've got those insights and that understanding, that's great. That's really what we wanna be able to get to, and quickly.
Yeah, I think it's important that you point out those numbers the way you did, because a lot of times when we are, I think about the operators sometimes that I've worked with in the past, like the executive directors or the community directors, and they're thinking in these terms of, I got to get a food order. And so that's a few $1,000s. Or maybe I've got to rent a generator for the day. And maybe that's a eight, 10,000, $12,000 a day for a few days kind of expense. But we're talking about an asset that can range anywhere from 15 to 30 to $50 million in value. And I don't know that we always think that way from that community level director's standpoint. So I'm glad you made that impression about the dollars. And so
Yeah.
one of the things when we first spoke that I think we really dove into that I'm interested to hear more about from you is the long tail of recovery in
Mhm.
any of these instances, right? We spend so much time thinking about the preparedness plan, what happens in those first few days, and getting to the, okay, we're quote unquote all clear from the actual event. But there's always, in any sort of serious disaster or crisis, there's going to be this long tail of recovery. And I think it gets overlooked. And so when you think about, or you're working with communities about this recovery phase and what it looks like, what do you think are some of the biggest mistakes communities make because they think the hard part is over?
Yeah, I love it. And that was it was a perfect segue because you just said a couple things in terms of generators and things like that. So I feel like, first of all, people will not understand their policy, and they won't understand the insurance play. And they need to have a really strong understanding of what their policy covers and doesn't cover. I have seen people not do what is needed for the structure, or for, say, power, which ultimately affects the residents and the structure, because they're trying to calculate, should I do a generator because it's going to be $3,400 a day just to be able to cover whatever 50 residents, when in fact most policies will cover that. And they're making judgment calls outside of policy and understanding that, where if they could just understand and have prepared that policy. This is where I think quarterly reviews is really important with all your stakeholders that really come to make up your team. When something's going to happen, these are going to be the people that are going to show up. Those questions surface all the time. Policies change, right?
Yeah.
Deductibles change. That changes the decision maker. This is very fluid, but if you understand your policy, you'll do what is needed. It frees you up to actually make very sound decisions instead of stepping over dollars to save pennies. I just see that time and time again on the recovery phase. And then not understanding the recovery phase And then just to clarify for your listeners, what I'm calling the recovery phase is that financial, it's the documentation, everything that happened from minute one of something occurring to your property and to the inside, whether it's inside or outside, all the way through to the end of the peril and the end of the remediation of this structure. And a couple of other blind spots that I've seen is not having vetted your vendors. So, do you know that if they're FEMA compliant, we're getting more and more FEMA declared perils. FEMA declared perils are then reimbursed through a different protocol. And if you don't have the right vendor in place that doesn't understand the documentation that's required from FEMA, there are situations where you're left holding the bag. Yeah, the documentation wasn't there. You did things outside of FEMA policy, even though you did them within the confines of your insurance policy. So there's just a couple of things, and not rocket science, but there's just a couple of things that you have to take into consideration so that you do understand when you're outlining something, your financial risk to being reimbursed. It's just distilling that down to that pillar within that pillar.
Yeah. But you mentioned something in there that I think in general is something that we should consider in all of our planning and preparedness is the idea of looking at things more frequently and analyzing and reviewing them. You said quarterly, which I can count on one hand the number of times I've worked with an operator who did that and made it that kind of a priority. Usually it's okay, we're getting ready for our annual survey, and that happens in some places every 2 years. And so, all right, so every 18 months to 24 months, we're looking at this when really, like you said, anything could happen at any time. And why wouldn't we want to be prepared for that? And I think that's such a great takeaway to not only about the plan in general, but also to start thinking about those policy logistics, like you said. And
Yeah, yeah, we see that too. And one of the things that I mentioned to my clients, especially when they have multiple locations, is it's 90 minutes a quarter to literally save you millions. And I don't know, I feel like in my business, somebody tells me you're spending 90 minutes a quarter taking care of protecting the fiscal responsibility around millions of dollars. I feel like it's a good use of my time.
yeah,
And just understanding truthfully that the reason why we don't do that is because we feel like it's insurmountable. When I go into locations with senior living, disaster recovery, and they're just hamstrung with so much legislation. And like you were saying, the surveys, which that's something that can have a completely different agenda too. Some of the agendas overlap in that survey, but really here, you're kind of getting your stakeholders to help you carry that ball.
right.
And if you can come in with that mindset and say, listen, I've got my remediation company, I've got my broker, my independent adjuster that I'm going to be using on my losses. I've got my team here. They're carrying that ball. Here we're talking about, okay, what is the new threshold? What is it that we want to talk about so that as a stakeholder group that was working collaboratively, then we're going to be able to work through this. A couple of questions that you need to ask as the administrator, as the operator, as the VPO is, has any of this changed? Take a look at this. I think it's different if we can take a look at, we can just shift that mindset. It's not this whole lift that needs to happen. It's actually being carried a lot by your stakeholders.
Yeah. And I think you've started to answer this question that I was thinking about, right? Because the work you do spans outside of the senior living space. You don't focus just on senior living. But senior living is, when it comes to this response and crisis management, it is fundamentally different than other industries like commercial or manufacturing, a commercial or manufacturing client. And so, how does that shape how you advise communities when it comes to doing all of this?
I talk a lot more about lead times, talk a lot more about just really bluntly, like relocation and the
Mhm.
thresholds around what will we do if there's relocation? How much more data are you required to have on the predictive view so that you can make your decisions way more upstream? Senior living is just so completely different.
Yeah.
Now, that human element and then a susceptible human element with belongings and health and physical constraints and just tolerance levels, things like that, just bring in all this, all these questions that need to be teased out ahead of time.
Yeah. You alluded to this earlier about the recovery process. It's not just getting things fixed, but it's handling insurance and getting reimbursed and getting your payments that you need so you can take care of things. And so I want to talk a little bit about the business side of that recovery, right? The claims, documentation, getting reimbursed. What do senior living operators need to know going in, and what do you wish more of them were proactive about to protect themselves financially?
Yeah. Being aware when there are policy changes is super key. And being okay to share that information. I'm not sure why every once in a while we'll go into a senior living and as one of the primary stakeholders with a remediation company, we want to make sure we understand the policy because we don't want to go outside of bounds. Or if we're getting ready to go outside of bounds, outside of sublimits, we want to be able to call that out so that everybody knows, hey, this is a timeout piece. Our run rate is rapidly approaching this sublimit. Do we want to keep going? What are the pros and cons? What's the
Yeah,
cost benefit? And we wanna be able to have those conversations so that everybody is out in the open and we don't run over those sublimits. The counter side to that is
right.
not knowing, not having insight on that. And then as a contractor, you're doing what is needed. And then suddenly you're outside of sublimits and maybe you're outside of reimbursements, period. You just need to be able to call that out, but if you're moving blindly, you really don't know that, and you don't know to relay that information. And
Yeah,
and like I said before, these things are always very fluid right now. We're in a world where insurance is changing very rapidly. So, it's something that I would really highlight to you and call attention to is just making sure that there's vigilance, and around that, that there's a really understanding,
yeah.
communicating that.
This was something that we didn't really talk about in our first conversation, but I'd love to get some thoughts around this because of the human element that you mentioned earlier. Most communities will, they're telling those the residents that live with them, get your own renter's insurance, make sure you have your own coverages. Should operators think differently about that? Or how does all of that play into the insurance and the back end payment of recovery? I know it's complicated, but I'd love to get your thoughts on that because it's not something that I've ever had to really think about until you mentioned it earlier of, oh, what do those individuals living in the community do? How can we support them to make this as seamless or be as helpful to them as possible?
Great question. Yeah, you're right, because we're focusing on these strenuous perils, these national catastrophes. But you're right. What about the day to day?
Yeah.
And the day to day, renters insurance, them understanding the residents, I mean by that, understanding what is really being covered with their renters insurance. Is it sudden and accidental? Things that are like what is typically what we see most often in senior living is water overflow from bathtubs and from sinks, number 1. Number 2 are minor fires, right? And then lastly are sewer overflows. And I think that those are it's really important for them to understand where their coverage stops and starts and where they're responsible and where they're not. That's even like typical homeowners really need to know
Right.
that, but residents for sure. Lastly, the thing that comes into play, which can be the most psychologically devastating for senior housing residents, is content coverage. Content coverage is very often very limited. And that's okay if somebody has very few things that they feel are not very valuable. But we actually tend to see a lot of times in these communities, the actual opposite is that things to them feel very valuable. They want that replacement value. And they've collected really, when they've downsized, they've really made sure that what is surrounding them are their collectibles that are of utmost importance to them. So content coverage is often not spoken about and then really not understood, but are most likely that tend to be very affected because they're in smaller areas. And so when you have a sink overflow or a toilet overflow for sure, these will affect these contents, these belongings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's a great call out because you're so dead on about the downsizing to the things that are really of value, right? I always just go back to all the different residents who will tell me about the things that they have, and they're always in their apartments and they're small, maybe, but they're very valuable and important to them. Do you ever see any sort of conflict in the recovery phase between what residents maybe who haven't been educated in what they do and them pressuring operators to try and maybe make up a difference? And what does that look like?
I do see a little bit of that. And I usually see operators feeling a sense of obligation to make them whole. Where I'm seeing a lot of pushback too is on the insurance side. Just, yeah, pushing back there a little bit. I think that they typically need their families involved when they're in that phase where adjusters will maybe get on the phone and have conversations that are a little complicated and
Right.
already for us, they're complicated. They're just complicated conversations. And so think it's I think it's important to have everybody at the table whenever there's a conversation that's going on with something like content or coverage.
Yeah.
We talk about that all the time. Hey, let's not have sidebar conversations. Let's have conversations that are highly collaborative, that are open, that are transparent, so that everybody's in the know. Everybody needs to be in the know anyhow, because this decision or something that's being alleged needs to be verified somewhere.
Yeah.
And then it also trickles down to, then how's it going to get handled, right? How will it get remediated? Or are you suggesting that it doesn't get remediated? We need to know that and just be able to have open and honest conversations. Things really will break down when people are having competing interests, and that'll show up through sidebar conversations. As soon as somebody's
Yeah.
having a sidebar conversation, I'm like, "Whoa, time out.
Yeah.
Why are we having sidebar conversations? What is this?"
I think the way you phrase that is so important too, right? Because a lot of times I've seen some residents are impacted, others aren't. And so some are engaged and others are just trying to work. And that there are families that maybe are very involved and families that are just disconnected. And they're like, you run the community, you're supposed to help mom with that, or those kinds of things. And I love the way you framed this as it's a collaborative conversation, no different than a care planning or dealing with a customer complaint around food or activities. It always kind of comes down to that. We all have to get together and solve the problem.
Exactly, yeah.
Claudine, I've loved this conversation because again, it's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but I've appreciated looking in at this back end and this bigger picture around your three pillars. So if a senior living VPO or executive, or even maybe an executive director for a large community is listening to this podcast, what's the one thing you want them to do as soon as this is over as soon as they get to their community or their office so they can protect their community, their residents, and their team.
I would say get your stakeholders together and schedule the QBRs. If there's one thing, you get them to help you. This is just you scheduling. And then, like I said, they'll do the lift. Things will come together. Conversations will happen. The decision-making process will become extremely clear. Ownership and accountability becomes very clear. I would say that's number one.
Yeah,
Definitely.
perfect. Claudine, let the listeners know how they can reach out to you to support this, maybe get more insights, how we maybe support getting everything that we just talked about set up for their operations.
Absolutely. And if they'd like to get the agenda, things like that, I definitely have materials that we can share that we've used in the past. So it's Claudine Ripert. It's Ripert. The French love to be complicated, silent T's. Anyways, I'm at Critical Control. It's criticalcontrol.co. I'm happy to answer any questions, help you in absolutely any way. And I would say just feel free you can reach me through the website or through LinkedIn, and happy to jump on a call at any time and point. There's really no bother.
Awesome. Claudine, thank you so much for taking time to deep dive into this for us and for being with us today on Tips from Trestle.
Thank you so much, Erin. I appreciate everything you're doing for this community. It's absolutely wonderful. So very appreciative. Thank you.
So there it is, everybody. Another one in the books. Thanks again for tuning in. Please follow and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on social media at Tips from Trestle. You can also learn more about the work I do by following me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. And be sure to check out Trestle Hospitality Concepts at www.trestlehospitalityconcepts.com. I'm your host, Aaron Fish, and this has been another episode of Tips from Trestle.